He let her believe she was the problem, but he was the one whose medical tests were completely final. Brandon tortured her with accusations, only to walk away. Now, he's staring at her 8-month pregnant belly in absolute disbelief. But the ultimate revenge isn't just the pregnancy, it's the sudden realization of who stood beside her in silence. Witness the exact moment an arrogant man realizes he lost control to a superior presence. Let us pause right here on this opening frame. You and I need to absorb the devastating irony. Watch Maddie push against those heavy, soundproof glass doors. The air inside this elite boutique is thick with the scent of expensive leather and old money. It is supposed to be a safe haven. But look closely at her hand, clamped over her ribs. Beneath that oversized wool coat, she is 8 months pregnant, her skin slick with cold sweat. She pulled off the impossible by escaping a kingpin of the criminal underworld. Yet the tragedy of survival is that we often carry the ghosts of our past straight into our future. She ran from a monster only to harbor his undeniable bloodline deep within her own body. A painful truth of life is that simply running away never erases what you carry inside. She is a walking harbinger of ruin. Picture this space not as a charming store, but as a sterile incubator where the untouchable elite purchase velvet thrones for their heirs. Maddie spent the last 8 months living like a ghost, severing every thread to that theater of quiet violence. She genuinely convinced herself she could simply vanish, but life has a way of forcing our hands. A child needs a crib. In the Ruthless network, she barely survived. Merely buying a pastel pacifier paints a massive target on your back. It is a harsh truth of the human condition. You can run to the absolute edge of the earth to find peace, but you can never truly outrun the physical consequences growing quietly inside of your own flesh. The most profound lesson we can learn is that our past choices always demand a reckoning. Pay close attention to the way she moves through this space. It is a masterful performance, yet entirely tragic. She fights every violent urge to snap her head around and check the shadowed corners for assassins. In the savage hierarchy she survived. Bleeding in open water guarantees you will be consumed. So she forces herself to stroll. She glides past the heavy velvet curtains as if she is just another bored wife of a billionaire. It breaks the heart to witness how profound trauma permanently rewires a person. The hardest lesson we ever learn is that true peace is never found in pretending to be safe. Even the girl behind the counter offers a dead, sterilized look that refuses to ask questions. Maddie is utterly surrounded by the cold machinery of unchecked power. Stick with me here, because this is where the tension becomes a living entity. The golden rule of this institutional silence is simple. You never ask where the unborn child came from. You just accept the cash and report back to the shadow rulers. Notice how the temperature in the room seems to plummet. Maddie feels the shift in her bones before her eyes confirm it. It is that suffocating pressure warning you a predator is watching. We learn quickly in life that fear is a useful compass, but panic is a permanent prison. You have to marvel at her iron will. Instead of surrendering to the terror creeping up her spine, she forces her racing heart to slow down. She drifts toward a row of reinforced wooden cribs that resemble tiny, armored bunkers far more than places of innocent rest. Look closely at the frame and process what is truly at stake. In the cold taxonomy of the underworld, an heir is never just an innocent infant. That child is a geopolitical asset, a literal chess piece maneuvered by violent men. The camera lingering on a trembling hand is devastating. She knows this baby could tear the syndicate apart. That is exactly why she condemned herself to this isolation. If the architect of her past discovers she carries his blood, he will not simply kill her. He will completely erase her autonomy and lock her away forever. The painful lesson we all must face is that our deepest secrets always demand a heavy toll. You can see the unadulterated terror flash in her eyes before she violently forces it back behind a clinical, deadened mask. It is genuinely brutal to watch her hands operate on pure instinct, subtly pulling the thick wool of her coat tighter across her rounded belly. It is an act of desperate, primal shielding. She walks through this high-stakes environment entirely alone, and that isolation is deliberate. She calculated the brutal odds long ago. She knows that in a world ruled by monsters, leaning on a trusted friend is the equivalent of signing a death warrant. We often forget that misplaced trust does not just break your heart. In her reality, it puts you in an unmarked grave. To protect a child tethered to such a horrifying lineage, a mother must look at every smiling stranger and envision an executioner. It is a desperately cold, fractured way to exist, entirely walled off from the warmth of the world. For one painfully beautiful second, her iron defenses crumble. She presses her trembling palm against the hidden curve of her stomach, whispering a silent promise entirely inside her own head. Paranoia is simply the weather she lives in now. But then, the illusion of safety shatters. We need to analyze this exact cinematic beat together. It is not the violent crack of a gunshot or a scream. It is a low, vibrating chuckle drifting across the showroom floor, instantly turning the blood in Maddie's veins to ice. Her knuckles lock onto the edge of the crib. Life teaches us that the darkest monsters often arrive quietly, without any grand warning. It is the horrifying, familiar cadence of the man who authored her suffering. The absolute nightmare just walked through the front door. The bitter tragedy is that she does not even need to turn her head to confirm his presence. That chilling vocal signature is permanently burned into the darkest corridors of her mind. It is the inescapable hallmark of a trauma bond. Moving with the stiff dread of a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows, she finally forces her chin up. And there he stands. Brandon. He consumes every ounce of oxygen in the room, as if he holds the deed to the air itself. Draped in black tailoring, he radiates a terrifyingly calm dominance. He never has to raise his voice or reveal a blade. He merely exists in the space, aware that no living soul could defy his will without meeting a violent end. The profound lesson here is that true power never has to shout. It simply waits in the silence. But an apex predator never stalks his territory without a trophy on his arm. Enter Savannah. Do not reduce her to a mere romantic partner. She is a highly calculated, weaponized asset. She glides into the room with the cruel precision of a scalpel, engineered to diminish anyone standing in her shadow. She bleeds generational wealth and untouchable cruelty. The very second Maddie locks eyes with her, the invisible walls of the boutique violently cave in. The suffocating claustrophobia of her former captivity floods her mind with panic. Life shows us that surviving one terrible storm only guarantees you will recognize the lightning of the next. Every primal instinct screams at Maddie right now. Drop the heavy coat. Run before his predatory gaze locks onto your exact coordinates. Fate always demands a tragic punchline. The universe rarely grants a bruised survivor a clean getaway. Savannah executes a lazy visual sweep of the showroom, her eyes functioning like predatory radar, until they snag violently onto Maddie's frozen form. There is an absolute void of empathy in her gaze. Instead, her painted lips stretch into a slow, terrifyingly satisfied smirk. She just located the wounded antelope separated from the herd. Well, she purrs, her voice smooth as glass but laced with venom. This is unexpected. She barely whispers the words, yet the chilling sound slices through the heavy air. We must remember a vital lesson. When monsters of this caliber acknowledge you, it is never a simple greeting. They are establishing ownership and pulling the invisible chains tight. Stick with me on this frame. The performance is absolutely devastating. Brandon registers the atmospheric shift. Initially, he appears utterly bored, indifferent to the luxury around him. But the exact second his dark eyes process Maddie's pale face, the foundation of his reality violently fractures. It is far more than shock. It is the horrifying realization of a tyrant discovering the one variable he failed to control. His gaze drags downward, magnetically pulled to the undeniable curve she desperately attempts to conceal. A hard truth of life is that control is a fragile illusion that always shatters when reality intervenes. For the very first time, the untouchable architect is completely unmoored, and Maddie refuses to blink, staring directly into the abyss of her worst nightmare. Every fragile illusion of safety she spent 8 months building has turned to ash. Brandon takes a single measured step forward. He does not scream or reach for a weapon. He moves with the lethal calibration of a demolition expert, examining a fatal crack in a foundation. And then he speaks her name, Maddie. The word is profoundly quiet, yet it strikes her chest like a physical blow. It is a heavy iron leash violently yanked back into his fist. One of the harshest lessons of survival is that our personal demons are terribly patient. In the span of a single breath, that sterile boutique dissolves into a brutal arena of psychological warfare. The terrible secret is permanently exposed to the blinding light. The desperate war for her unborn child has officially begun. Let us pause right here, you and I, and look closely at the way Savannah moves. She refuses to rush or elevate her voice. In this brutal syndicate, women learn early that panic earns a quick grave, while calculated silence wins a blood-stained crown. Notice how she glides across that marble floor like a ghost, making a spectacle of her coldness. She examines Maddie without any human warmth, studying her like a jeweler, scrutinizing a flaw in a worthless stone. It breaks my heart to watch, because the great tragedy of blind ambition is that the entry fee is always your humanity. Savannah buried her soul to become the sharpest monster in the room. When you trade empathy for a seat at the table, you never truly win. You just become the wooden board they play the game on. The heaviest blows in life rarely arrive with a loud roar. They slip through the air as a fragile whisper. Watch the camera pan across this suffocating room as Savannah leans in, dropping her tone to a silken pitch. She claims not to recognize Maddie, letting the silence stretch until it chokes everyone. "You look different," she breathes, turning a simple phrase into a sharpened blade. In the dim corner, Brandon just stares. His eyes are hollow voids, stripped of feeling. His carefully crafted empire is crumbling because his chosen victim no longer plays her part. It is a quiet tragedy to witness. Clinging to a fake version of someone else only shatters your own mind when the genuine truth finally steps into the light. Let us watch this unfold together, you and I, because this scene is a masterclass in psychological ruin. Brandon shifts his hollow gaze downward. Locking onto the heavy coat, Maddie desperately pulls around her shoulders. The silence turns so dense, it practically bruises the skin. Savannah unleashes a perfectly dead smile, asking if Maddie is 8 months along. It is a cold public execution. They are weaponizing pure innocence, twisting an unborn child into a blade to bleed a woman dry in front of an audience. It breaks the heart to watch such malice play out, yet it reveals a brutal truth about human nature. People who thrive in darkness will always try to turn your greatest blessing into a source of shame, just to keep you trapped beneath them. Murmurs ripple through the boutique like smoke, creeping under a locked door. Focus entirely on Maddie for a second. Her knuckles turn white as she grips her coat, but her expression remains frozen. This is not defiance. This is the tragic stillness of a survivor who learned to turn into stone just to endure. She says it is none of their concern, her tone stripped of emotion. Savannah simply feeds on that resistance. She sweeps her gaze over the gleaming chandeliers to remind Maddie that in their beautiful rotting syndicate, freedom is a myth. The luxurious walls press inward like silent accomplices. It is a bitter reality we must face. Sometimes the most impossible prisons to escape are not made of iron bars, but of pure gold and the suffocating weight of social expectations. A ragged breath escapes Brandon, and his illusion of the calculating aristocrat vanishes entirely. What replaces it is a portrait of pure, obsessive rage. He glares down at her with a tight jaw, accusing her of vanishing without a single word. The tragic irony hangs heavily in the room. He twists her desperate flight for survival into a personal betrayal. He wants guilt to crush her for refusing to remain his emotional punching bag. In the past, that dark manipulation would have worked flawlessly, bending her into quiet apologies just for wanting to breathe. It is devastating to realize how many souls fall into this exact trap. If a person makes you feel guilty for walking away from their cruelty, they never truly loved you. They only ever loved the feeling of controlling you. The old tricks fail to draw blood today. Maddie refuses to shatter. Savannah closes the distance, stepping so near that her heavy perfume wraps around Maddie like a chokehold. She drops her voice into a sweet whisper, murmuring that a hidden community is a dangerous game in their social circles. The words strike the floor like a heavy bell. You and I can feel the atmosphere shift as these elegant women transform into a circle of starving wolves. Savannah smiles, basking in the ruin she orchestrates. The harsh lesson is written plainly across this tragic scene. A corrupt system will always panic the moment it encounters something it cannot command. When you finally break free from a toxic environment, your very independence becomes their absolute greatest fear. In this fractured moment, that unborn child becomes a glaring beacon of rebellion. Brandon clenches his jaw. He shifts his weight to seal off her exit, demanding in a terrifyingly soft voice to know who she moved on with. A whispered threat always cuts deeper than a loud scream. He tries to drown her in raw panic beneath the heavy stairs of the boutique. Yet, instead of shrinking into the quiet victim she once was, Maddie slowly lifts her chin. No tears fall, only a haunting, clinical calm remains in her eyes. That calm is the fatal strike. A tormentor knows precisely how to battle your rage, but they will completely choke on your cold indifference. True peace is never found in screaming at your demons. It is found in realizing their toxic voices simply do not matter anymore. I did not move on, Maddie replies, without a single tremor. I moved away. Those words crash through the room with devastating force. They carry the heavy weight of the truth, which is absolute poison for souls drowning in delusion. For a brief second, Savannah's perfectly sculpted expression fractures. Brandon's eyes widen as his empire of control crumbles into dust. It is pure, poetic justice to watch. They cornered her, expecting to feast on her humiliation, but Maddie sees the sudden terror bleeding into their eyes. The life she carries destroys their fragile game. This moment reveals a beautiful life lesson. The cruelest figures never operate from a place of true strength. Their malice is merely a pathetic shield designed to hide their own devastating insecurities. The silence is pulled so tight it hums like a wire ready to snap. Brandon is visibly unspooling, his shoulders locking as he attempts to stare her down like a wounded predator. Sensing their dominance turning to ash, Savannah ruthlessly pivots to rewrite the narrative. "We need to examine this closely, you and I." She adopts a gentle, mocking tone, questioning if Maddie fled from responsibility rather than saving her life. It is a vicious tactic, meant to convince the room that Maddie is a coward rather than a brave survivor. She is stealing Maddie's truth in broad daylight. The vital lesson here rings incredibly clear. You must never surrender the pen to someone else. If you let another person write your story, they will make sure you always play the villain. Brandon violently shatters her personal space, stepping so close that the sharp notes of his cologne choke the air from her lungs. Scent is an unforgiving anchor to trauma, and he weaponizes it flawlessly. He hisses through his teeth, demanding an apology he never earned. Then his dark eyes drop to her stomach, and a wave of pure revulsion washes over his face. He cannot stomach the living evidence that she built a beautiful life without his permission. For a man addicted to control, watching a former victim flourish is far more agonizing than a physical blow. It shatters the pathetic mythology he built around himself. Never forget this essential truth. The most devastating revenge you can inflict upon those who tried to break you is to simply walk away and be happy. Maddie absorbs the heavy weight of his glare, yet her shoes remain firmly anchored to the marble. She fought too hard to heal her mind, to let this phantom drag her back into the dirt. Just as violence threatens to spill, the room's temperature plummets. Stick with me, because you and I are about to witness the stark contrast between a loud coward and a truly dangerous man. The venomous whispers evaporate. Without a single command, every gaze releases Brandon and snaps toward the doorway. It is pure cinematic poetry to observe. Weak men like Brandon must bare their teeth to manufacture respect, but lethal power never raises its voice. Real strength simply steps into the light, and the world instinctively falls silent. That is, the quiet peace we must strive to cultivate in our lives. A low voice rumbles through the heavy air over Maddie's shoulder. That is enough. Those 3 words, delivered with chilling calm, instantly shatter the tension in the boutique. Before she even turns, the rigid fear melts from her spine. His presence anchors her like a heavy ship in a brutal storm. The irony is genuinely beautiful. She looks at Colton Hale, a man with a dark reputation, yet beside him, she feels completely untouchable. Colton does not storm the room, beating his chest like a boy searching for a brawl. He simply glides into the space beside her, shifting his shoulders to forge an invisible fortress against the wolves. True protectors do not incite violence to prove their worth. They offer a quiet, steadfast shelter that stops the chaos dead before it touches you. Let us pause the time frame right here, because this is the exact second the power dynamic flips. Colton stands dangerously at ease, a coiled viper masquerading as a statue. When his dark eyes drift to the man threatening her, the room's food chain violently resets. Brandon scrambles to maintain composure. A flicker of genuine terror betrays his eyes before he pastes his fragile mask back into place. He puffs his chest, demanding to know who Colton is, but his voice rings hollow. Colton then executes the most devastating psychological maneuver possible. He offers absolute silence. He lets the dead air stretch out until Brandon shrinks into a total joke. Here is a simple lesson. Genuine authority never screams for validation. When a true shadow falls, there is nowhere left to hide. The camera pushes in on Savannah, the harsh lighting catching the faint tremors in her jaw. Her eyes narrow into frantic slits as her fabricated confidence splinters. It is like watching a tyrant short-circuit when their victim finally fights back. She attempts to puff her chest, snapping that she did not ask for an audience. But Colton does not blink. He dismantles her entirely. His voice drops into a dead murmur, flatly stating she has not earned the right to speak. Absolute ice water. In the background, the suffocating shadow hanging over Maddie finally fractures. The invisible leash snaps, freeing her from years of paralysis. A beautiful truth emerges here. The exact second you realize the monster under your bed is just a fading memory, it loses all its power to harm you. Moments ago, Maddie was bracing for impact, mentally curling into a ball to absorb whatever cruelty her abuser planned to hurl next. But the room's temperature has violently plummeted. Colton makes no move to act as her new master. He merely stands there, an immovable stone wall in the dim lighting, offering her the space to finally catch her breath. It shows how finding one safe soul can unclench a heart trapped in silence. Meanwhile, Brandon is rapidly unraveling. The fallen dictator cannot process someone defying his script. He huffs out a breath, accusing Colton of trespassing, but the venom has leaked out of his voice. He watches his twisted empire burn. Remember this well. Those who ruthlessly demand total control are always the ones most terrified of being left with nothing. Colton delivers the most chilling line of the sequence here. He does not raise his voice. He simply states, with a perfectly flat tone, that it is his business because it is her business. That singular sentence swings a wrecking ball into Brandon's fragile ego and violently silences Savannah. The camera lingers on Maddie, suspended between the ghost of the man who shattered her and this unshakable new protector. In that quiet shadow, a vital spark ignites behind her eyes. The nightmare is no longer dragging her under. It is merely happening around her. The cruelest joke of a toxic bond is the illusion of absolute powerlessness. Right here, she realizes she is no longer the prey. The lesson is clear. Your past only dictates your future if you willingly agree to keep playing the victim. You and I have probably stood in a room when the atmospheric pressure shifts, and it is a tragic beauty to witness. Focus the lens on Savannah. That plastic smile remains, but the muscles around her mouth pull painfully tight. You can hear the frantic grinding in her mind as she tries to salvage a game she thought she had won. She operates like a parasite, seeking a fresh nerve to bite. But Brandon is the true spectacle. He physically locks up, his eyes widening in the dim light. This is not mere annoyance on his face. It is the cold terror of realizing a true predator just stepped into his territory. His existence relies entirely on a fabricated crown. Here is a quiet truth to remember. The loudest person in the room is always the one most paralyzed by the fear of being exposed as a fraud. The tragedy of Brandon is that his fragile ego forbids him from retreating, even when outmatched. Watch the subtle shift in his posture. He forces his chest to rise and fall slower. Panting behind a mask of calm, he snaps his venomous focus back to Maddie. He remains obsessed with breaking her, convinced she is still his property. Lowering his voice to a gravelly whisper, he employs a classic trick to manufacture an illusion of danger. He sneers through the shadows, accusing her of fleeing just to find another man to fight her battles. It is a chilling strike meant to rip away her armor and shove her back into the dark corner she escaped. Listen carefully. Tearing another human being down to make yourself appear taller is the ultimate proof that you are only shrinking on the inside. Now the shadow deepens as the vulture swoops in. Savannah seizes the tension, plastering on a theatrical expression, but the camera catches the poison in her eyes. She sings the accusation of the pregnancy, gesturing toward Colton as if unearthing a sordid crime. For Maddie, the words land with the crushing weight of a falling sky. In the twisted world these people inhabit, a woman standing beside a strong man is never viewed as safe. She is perceived merely as an object, traded from one master to the next. It is a cruel psychological blade, forged to drag Maddie back into the labyrinth of her self-doubt. Let this be a firm lesson. Toxic souls will constantly try to convince you that your sanctuary is just another prison, simply because they cannot stand the sight of your freedom. That narrative slices deeper than any physical blow Brandon could deliver. Focus on Maddie's trembling hands. Her knuckles turn ghost white as her fingers dig into her coat. Her nervous system screams danger before her mind processes the strike. But watch the beautiful tragedy of her resilience. She forces her bones to freeze. She draws a ragged breath and silently refuses to let their deranged theater dictate her reality. She spent years breaking her spine to accommodate their madness, and she is finally walking away. Brandon sees this quiet rebellion, and his eyes darken into a hollow rage. He snaps violently, demanding her submission as the pressure mounts. A crucial truth to carry with you. The moment you refuse to bend backward, the people who loved walking all over you will lose their minds. Stick with me, because we are about to unpack the darkest layer of this dynamic. The interrogation about the child was never a quest for truth. It is a serrated blade designed to publicly bleed her of dignity. It is an ambush, magnified by the voyeuristic gaze of hungry bystanders. Savannah tilts her head, bathed in cruel light, mimicking a villain who delights in the squirming of victims. She weaves fake honey into her voice, suggesting the crowd deserves to feast on the tragedy, using the biology of motherhood as a cage. The silence turns into a crushing weight, a classic vice meant to crack her armor. Remember this quiet grace as you navigate life. No one is ever entitled to the darkest, most broken chapters of your story just because they ask with a painted smile. The true agony of this scene lies in Maddie's paralyzed tongue. The stakes of her survival are severe, and her sacred secret does not belong in the hands of these shattered souls. Before she can plot an escape, Savannah casually detonates the room. Invading Maddie's space, she drops a venomous whisper, accusing her of silence only because she does not know who fathered the child. It is a masterpiece of cruelty. That accusation acts as a lit match tossed into a pool of gasoline. The atmospheric shift is terrifying. Idle curiosity curdles into a nasty, judgmental hum. The wolves are baring their teeth, circling the wounded deer in the stark lighting. The most heartbreaking lesson you will face is this: a hungry crowd will always devour a juicy lie rather than sit with a complicated, painful truth. In the theater of a toxic clique, truth is irrelevant. Ruin only requires poison and an audience starving for drama. But watch Colton carefully. His reaction is a cinematic study in lethal restraint. He barely shifts his weight, yet the air thickens, signaling a fatal line has been crossed. He locks onto Savannah with the hollow stare of a shark ascending from the deep. He warns her she is wading into dark waters she cannot fathom. The brilliance is in his delivery. He offers no raised voice, no theatrical threat. He simply narrates the absolute certainty of her destruction. For the first time, Savannah's painted smile stutters. The camera captures the tremor of panic in her throat. A timeless truth reveals itself here. When a manufactured persona collides with a genuine, unyielding threat, the porcelain mask will always crack. Savannah chokes on her panic, gasping that secrets always rise to the surface, clawing desperately for control. Beside her, Brandon's jaw locks. The stunt pushes his obsessive need for dominance into overdrive. He turns his dark gaze to Maddie, demanding a confession. He slips into that chilling, hypnotic cadence abusers use to pacify victims. It is the exact acoustic poison that built her psychological prison. For one terrifying frame, you see the undertow of past trauma dragging her back into the freezing depths. But then, the anchor holds. Colton remains planted at her side, as immovable as a mountain, and the dark spell shatters. He does not scream or draw a sword. He simply holds the line in the shadows. A profound lesson to remember. A true protector does not force you out of the storm. They calmly stand in the rain beside you. Let us look at this final piece together, shall we? We are often told that healing requires running away, but true salvation is standing in the shadow of the monster who broke you and feeling absolutely nothing. The camera catches a slight tremor as Maddie lifts her chin. Her voice, once fragile, slices through the heavy tension like a polished blade staring directly into the void of Brandon's eyes. She tells him plainly that she owes him nothing. It is a brilliant display of boundary setting that causes his reality to short-circuit entirely. His egos simply cannot process this untouchable version of the person he used to control. Savannah burns in the background, while Colton remains perfectly silent. Here is a simple lesson for life. When you build a wall of self-respect, you do not owe anyone a window to look through. Pause the frame right here. Let you and I step into this suffocating room together. The tension in the air compresses, humming like a piano wire pulled taut until it screams. Notice how the stark overhead lights cast deep shadows over Brandon's face as he locks eyes with Maddie. This is no longer fake concern on his part. You are witnessing the naked panic of a control freak, feeling his dominion slip right through his trembling fingers. He has never tasted the word no, and her quiet certainty is fracturing his entire reality. Remember this simple, meaningful life lesson: the loudest anger always erupts from the weakest foundation. For one terrifying heartbeat, you think the man might actually shatter. But watch that subtle twitch. He is rapidly calculating a dangerous new math in his head. The narrative just flipped entirely on its head. Brandon's gaze disconnects from the present moment. He is not retreating. He is rapidly recalculating his survival while drowning in a memory that shatters his reality. Beside him stands Savannah, the ultimate puppet master, who detects his slip instantly. She sees his rigid jaw and collapsed posture, and her fingers clamp down on his arm like a steel trap. Do not mistake that for a loving touch. It is a physical restraint designed to lock him right back into his cage. "What is it?" she asks, her voice bleeding with sudden paranoia. Brandon gives her absolutely nothing. His eyes set firmly on Maddie. Always remember this simple, meaningful life lesson. You can never truly hide your darkest obsession, no matter who is holding your arm. When his mental gymnastics finally collapse, the crash is truly brutal to witness. "We came here for a reason," Brandon announces loudly. His voice slices through the suffocating air, a desperate attempt to ground his spiraling mind. Right there, the camera catches Savannah's perfect mask slipping. It is just a microscopic blink, but the ultimate manipulator is knocked completely off her pedestal. "What are you talking about?" she demands, failing to hide the raw panic in her tone. Brandon lets out a ragged breath and drags a trembling hand through his hair, a textbook tale of severe distress. The air preparations he blurts out blindly. "Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. Your deepest secrets will always betray you when terror takes the wheel." The truth spills out before he can stop it. The physical reaction in the frame is instantaneous. Savannah's fingers dig into his arm like an iron vice, her knuckles turning white. She drops the subtle control entirely. This is an aggressive restraint meant to violently snap his attention back to her. The what? She demands. Notice how her voice drops. She abandons the polite, high society persona she was just weaponizing against Maddie. The power dynamic flips upside down. Brandon freezes. It is only a fraction of a second, but that tiny hesitation is a full-blown guilty plea. You said we were browsing, she hisses, her tone vibrating with the sheer terror of losing control. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. When a person who needs control loses their carefully written script, they reveal their true, terrifying nature. You can practically hear their toxic alliance snapping right down the middle. Savannah's eyes widen with genuine panic as she watches her perfectly engineered narrative burn to ash. Brandon's gaze darts frantically between his new prize and Maddie. His tough guy armor is melting into pure, primitive desperation before our eyes. Savannah, not here, he mutters under his breath, trying weakly to do some damage control, but the psychological blast radius is already far too large to contain. The suffocating weight of what he just admitted hangs heavily in the dead silence. Hair preparations are blood-bound commitments to generational dominance. Take a simple, meaningful life lesson from this tragic moment. Absolute control is a fragile illusion we cling to when we are too terrified to face our own reality. In a single cinematic second, the gravity of the room shifts. Nobody is looking at Maddie anymore. Every eye is locked onto the dark motives behind Brandon's meltdown. Beside Maddie, look closely at Colton. He maintains a baseline of chilling calm, shifting his weight with the quiet confidence of an apex predator. Who knows true dominance means never having to lift a single finger. He simply watches their toxic relationship fracture in real time. Savannah physically recoils from Brandon. Her hand drops from his sleeve like his skin is radioactive. You lied to me, she states coldly. All that calculated smoothness is gone, replaced by volatile exposure. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. The bitterest part of deceiving others is the inevitable moment you finally deceive yourself. Brandon's jaw locks up so tight that you can almost hear his teeth grinding together. I did not lie, he snaps back, his voice thick with unhidden panic. I just did not explain everything, he weakly tries to rationalize. That is the exact same thing. Savannah fires back without missing a beat. Her icy composure has evaporated, exposing a molten core of pure rage. This is a catastrophic glitch in her perfect matrix. Meanwhile, the camera pans slowly over to Maddie, who is standing perfectly still. The suffocating pressure has lifted off her shoulders, giving her a brief second to breathe. But beneath that relief, a much colder truth hits her about his dark agenda. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. An aggressive denial is always the absolute loudest confession of a guilty conscience. The scene vibrates with the ugly exposure of his rotting motives. You only get to witness this kind of psychological rupture when a manipulator's fabricated reality finally caves in on itself. In this brutal game of control, there are no accidents. Suddenly, Colton shatters the heavy tension with a voice that is terrifyingly calm, telling Brandon he has far bigger problems to worry about. The irony hangs in the air, thick and brutal. This is the textbook unraveling of a complete megalomaniac. Brandon buried a toxic secret, and now the earth opens up to swallow him whole. Savannah twitches with the erratic energy of someone going down with a burning ship. Her beautiful mask is gone entirely. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. The higher the pedestal you build from your lies, the deadlier the fall will be. Savannah shifts her predatory focus off Maddie and locks onto Brandon like a missile. Stick with me. You and I are about to watch this get incredibly interesting. This is the exact moment the calculating enabler realizes her golden goose is actually a sinking ship. Brandon is trapped between two collapsing fronts. His false authority evaporates, while his massive ego frantically tries to keep both women on a tight leash. Meanwhile, Maddie stands isolated in the center of the blast radius. Her body, carrying the burden of her child, begins to physically absorb this toxic trauma. A deep, agonizing tightening starts low in her abdomen, a brutal warning from her nervous system. Learn this simple, meaningful life lesson. Your body will always keep the score, even when your mind bravely tries to weather the storm. Watch Maddie very closely in this shot. She shifts her weight in a pure survival reflex, pressing her trembling hand hard against her side. Her breathing turns jagged, broadcasting her hidden agony to anyone who can read human biology. Colton possesses that exact training. He does not need her to utter a single syllable. His eyes narrow with the cold precision of a seasoned operative, tuning out the pathetic soap opera playing out next to them. He orders her to look directly at him, throwing her a psychological lifeline to pull her out of the dark. She tries to obey, but a brutal wave of pain crashes hard into her. In the middle of this emergency, Savannah cruelly snaps, demanding to know what is wrong with her. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. A truly toxic soul will never be able to see anyone else's pain but their own. The sheer emptiness of Savannah's question is enough to freeze your blood. It is completely devoid of empathy, dripping instead with raw irritation. To her warped mind, Maddie's suffering is nothing more than a rude interruption to her drama. Brandon finally rips his attention back to the woman he ruined. He steps forward with a flicker of what a fool might call genuine concern, though it is heavily polluted by his twisted sense of possessive entitlement. He asks if she is okay, desperately grasping at the control he is rapidly bleeding out. But Colton smoothly slides right into the empty space between them, turning his solid frame into a literal, unmovable brick wall. Here is a simple, meaningful life lesson. Real protection is never about screaming aggression. It is about standing immovable between the innocent victim and the raging storm. Colton tells him she needs breathing room, his voice carrying the finality of a closing vault door. He leaves zero margin for negotiation. You can see the muscles in Brandon's face twitching with pure rage. His mind rejects the concept of a boundary, but Colton's imposing presence forces him to freeze. Brandon barks wildly that he is not talking to Colton, claiming the man has no right to step in. Colton does not even blink. He stares right through him and softly replies that he already did. Think about the tragedy here. While these two men are locked in a silent war for dominance, Maddie is simply fighting to draw a breath, gripping the table so she does not collapse. Take this meaningful life lesson with you. True power never has to scream to prove it is standing in the room. The air in the room turns heavy, pressing down on Maddie as her vision begins to blur. The jagged edge of physical pain crashes directly into the emotional wreckage she thought she had left behind. She planned a clean break from the suffocating gravity of Brandon's control. Instead, he drags her right back into the nightmare. A sharp spasm of agony hits her, tearing a raw gasp from her throat before she can bite it down. It is the absolute breaking point. Colton immediately steps into the frame, reading the fatal tension in the room. His voice drops into a chilling, absolute calm as he declares they are leaving. Let this be a meaningful life lesson for us all. Sometimes, the only way to win a toxic game is to completely walk off the board and never look back. You and I must look closely at Colton in this frame. Notice how his hand hovers just an inch from Maddie's arm. It is the heavy hesitation of a man desperate to shield her, yet terrified of crossing an unseen line. He tells her to sit, but Maddie attempts to play the unbreakable hero, whispering she is fine even as her frame trembles. The body always betrays the brave face. Brandon steps forward, his ego bruised by another man protecting her. But Colton stops his entire existence with one quiet, lethal sentence. If she is hurt, Brandon is the reason why. Guilt paralyzes him instantly, leaving Savannah completely silent in the background. The harsh reality of life is that a bully only maintains their power until someone holds up a mirror to their own sins. Watch Savannah in the background. A heartbeat ago, she was the queen of the room, but now her gaze is cold. She calculates her next move like a predator, realizing her prey actually has teeth. Maddie forces her trembling legs to stand straight. She battles her own nervous system, fighting off the rising panic. She is no longer surviving for herself. She is remembering the unborn child inside her. It is a raw moment, proving a mother will endure any hell to protect her baby. The victim routine evaporates. Colton witnesses this profound shift, transforming into a quiet, immovable anchor at her side. The hard truth of life is that real love is not about fighting someone else's battles. It is about standing perfectly firm, giving them a safe foundation to fight their own. Colton leans in, whispering that she does not have to stay and endure this. His steady voice completely grounds her, pulling her out of a terrifying panic attack. In this fragile instant, Maddie realizes she can simply walk away without it feeling like a defeat. Meanwhile, look at Brandon's rigid posture across the room. He is entirely frozen. He built his whole identity around pulling emotional strings, and now he is forced to watch his fragile empire crumble in real time. It is a pathetic sight, witnessing his absolute blindness to his own ruin. The air turns dangerously toxic. Listen to me carefully on this one. When the person you have kept crushed under your thumb finally chooses to break the script, your grand empire of lies will always collapse right on top of you. Let us examine this critical frame together. This is no longer petty drama over reputations. The focus shifts entirely to the unborn child, a wild card that brutally detonates the power dynamic of their twisted circle. The tension snaps, yet not a single physical blow is thrown. Instead, the heavy weight of unspoken secrets claws its way to the surface. Brandon's perfectly curated mask finally fractures. He looks at Maddie and realizes she is no longer a hollow puppet he can manipulate. She is a living, breathing force he cannot dominate. This is the fatal wound for his inflated ego. The most agonizing fear for a master manipulator is never about losing a physical fight. It is the suffocating terror of realizing they can no longer write the script for everyone else's lives. The atmosphere shifts, but in a room packed with emotional sharks, it is like a drop of blood in dark water. Savannah catches the scent instantly. Her artificial smile dissolves. Leaving the cold eyes of a ruthless interrogator, she demands to know what he is hiding. It is a beautifully brutal confrontation. Brandon exhales heavily, dragging a trembling hand through his hair. He tries to maintain his cool, but you can see the panic sweating out of his pores. He mutters a weak excuse, claiming this is not the time or place. Yet his wide eyes betray him. He cannot stop staring at Maddie, consumed by the dark truth he buried. Here is a harsh reality of life. You can lie to everyone for years, but the mind will always break down and confess the exact thing it desperately wants to hide. Notice how Colton remains anchored, refusing to speak a single word. It is a stroke of psychological brilliance. By letting the silence drag out, he crafts an agonizing pressure cooker, forcing every ugly secret to boil over. Maddie feels the gravity of the moment. The truths she sacrificed to protect are dragged into the light. Entirely because Brandon's ego is tearing itself apart, Savannah gets dangerously close to Brandon's face, her composure totally shattered. She stares into his soul, accusing him of concealing a massive betrayal. The impact of her words hits him like a physical blow. The biggest takeaway here is this: sometimes absolute silence is far more lethal than shouting. If you simply step back, a guilty person will always interrogate and destroy themselves. The suspense in this room is so thick it chokes the lungs. Brandon swallows hard, his jaw clenching as his terrified eyes drop to Maddie's stomach. Every ounce of his fake swagger has vanished. He is replaced by a broken man whose entire universe is short-circuiting. He weakly stammers that he did not think this was even possible, and then simply freezes. That fragmented sentence completely hypnotizes the room. Look closely at Maddie's face. She does not flinch. She gazes back with a quiet, tragic understanding, finally seeing the broken reality of his mind. You and I know the golden rule here. A lie is just a fragile house of cards. No matter how meticulously a manipulator builds their false reality, the harsh truth is destined to eventually kick down the front door. Watching a man unravel on screen is pure tragedy. Savannah finally snaps. Her patience evaporates as she demands to know what he means, her voice cracking under the weight of paranoia. Brandon slowly blinks, as if silently begging the universe to pull him from this nightmare. But when his eyes open, the untouchable villain is dead. He confesses he cannot have children. The revelation hits the room like a shockwave. Notice the staging of this climax. Nobody screams, nobody shatters a glass. The room plunges into a heavy, suffocating silence that drowns every soul inside it. That is the devastating nature of true heartbreak. The most destructive truths in life do not arrive with grand fireworks. They show up in absolute silence, burning your deeply held illusions entirely to ash. Savannah stares at him, her posture broken as her relationship dissolves into a cruel joke. She whispers a shattered question, the emotional devastation palpable. Brandon cannot bear to meet her gaze. He locks his desperate eyes onto Maddie, begging his former victim to shield him from his shame. He confesses he knew all along. His infertility was a documented fact. Then, he unleashes a pathetic excuse. He claims he walked away to protect Maddie from discovering it was his fault. It is a sickening display of manipulation. Yet you cannot look away from the wreckage. Let this sit with you as a bitter life lesson. A coward will never admit they were terrified. They will always rewrite their cruelest betrayals as tragic sacrifices, just to avoid facing their own pathetic weakness. Stick with me here. We need to unpack the beauty of this moment. Flashes of regret cross Brandon's face, but it is too late to rewrite the script. Maddie lets out a trembling breath, and you can see the heavy chains falling off her soul. For months, he poisoned her mind, making her believe she was the broken one. Hearing him confess the truth is like drawing her first clean breath in years, even though the room is a powder keg. An immense psychological weight evaporates from her shoulders. Meanwhile, Savannah stumbles backward, her composure ruined as she realizes she was just another pawn. The lesson shining through this tragedy is clear. When you choose to build a toxic alliance with a snake, you have no right to act shocked when it eventually sinks its fangs into you. Savannah pins him against the absolute truth, tearing away the cowardly fiction he used to shield his fragile ego. You can almost feel the physical impact as Brandon recoils, completely broken. The camera slowly tracks to Colton as he steps out of the shadows, his voice heavy as a gavel coming down. He points out the ultimate cruelty. Brandon let Maddie carry the crushing weight of a failure that belonged entirely to him. Stripped of every comforting excuse, Brandon stands there, hollowed out, a mere ghost of the man he pretended to be. The ultimate lesson here is quite simple. Running from your own mistakes never actually saves you. It just guarantees that when the truth finally catches up, it will take your dignity along with it. The camera pulls back, capturing a room that suddenly feels entirely empty of oxygen. You and I are watching a modern tragedy unfold right here, frame by agonizing frame. Brandon's psychological armor, built to mask his deep insecurities, shatters into dust. If he is not the father, then the darkest question remains. Who exactly is? Savannah stands frozen, her mind violently rewriting history as she sifts through years of careful lies. But watch the framing closely here. Focus entirely on her eyes. The initial heartbreak vanishes, replaced by a freezing, calculated emptiness. It teaches us a haunting truth about human nature. A broken heart does not always look for peace and healing. Sometimes, it immediately starts sharpening a knife for absolute revenge. Let the lens push in slowly on the terrifying shift in Savannah's posture. We are witnessing the exact moment a wounded animal decides to become the apex predator. She locks her cold gaze onto Maddie, searching her face for even a single flicker of guilt. Brandon is completely out of focus now, trembling and shouting his desperate questions. Savannah treats his panic like static on a radio. Her entire being is fixated on the catastrophic secret sitting right across from her. Her voice drops, freezing the air. "You did not tell him," she murmurs. The emotion is gone, leaving only surgical precision. It points to a bleak but essential rule of life. Secrets are never just hidden pieces of information. They are invisible chains, and the person keeping them holds all the true power. Notice how the emotional temperature of the entire scene plummets. Savannah drops the theatrical shouting and delivers a quiet, surgical observation that cuts incredibly deep. The camera catches Maddie's physical betrayal beautifully. Look at her trembling hands, fingers digging desperately into her coat as she realizes her camouflage is burning away. Beside her, Brandon is mentally collapsing. He demands answers, shouting as if volume alone can bend reality back to what it was just a minute ago. But the director strips him of all authority here. He is completely helpless. It brings up a brutal lesson we all face eventually. The control we think we have over our daily lives is nothing but a comforting illusion, right up until someone quietly walks in and shatters the glass. Brandon begs to understand, his voice cracking and exposing a man stripped of all his former dignity. Savannah does not even blink. "I am implying," she states with a hollow calmness, "that this child is a highly calculated decision. This is the precise beat where the genre of the story violently shifts. We are no longer watching a domestic drama. We are locked inside a thriller." Look closely at Colton in the background. He has not moved an inch, but his broad shoulders lock into place like a guard dog smelling blood. His utter stillness is the most terrifying part of the entire frame. It teaches us a very painful truth about the world. Real danger never waves its arms to get your attention. It simply walks into the room quietly, smiles at you, and locks the heavy door behind you. Watch the screen closely, because this is where the power dynamic fully fractures. Colton tracks every tiny shift in the room, and suddenly his dark eyes lock onto Savannah. "Be careful," he warns. His delivery is totally flat, but underneath that tone is a heavy promise of violence. Savannah meets his stare with the chilling smile of a detective who just found the weapon. "I understand far more than you realize," she shoots back, pinning Maddie under a harsh psychological light. "You were always so quiet." Savannah breathes out, turning those silent years into a weapon. It makes you reconsider every past interaction. Because the hardest lesson in life is that the quietest people are rarely just shy. They are silently taking notes, gathering the exact ammunition needed to take you down. The script leaves zero room for mercy as Savannah strikes at the fatal wound. She exposes how everyone viewed Maddie as a weak victim, entirely missing that Maddie was running her own silent operation. Watch Maddie S. breathing slow down. It is the natural human instinct to brace for a massive impact. Meanwhile, Brandon S. face twists into the mask of a lost child. His towering arrogance kept him totally blind. "What are you talking about?" he pleads, watching his kingdom turn to ash. Savannah completely ignores him. "She knew you could never give her a child," she states plainly, dropping an absolute anvil on the conversation. It highlights a bitter reality of our daily lives. The absolute, loudest, most demanding egos always shatter into the smallest pieces when the truth finally arrives. The fallout from that single line is absolutely atomic. The camera snaps to Brandon, his eyes wide, silently begging his wife to wake him from this nightmare. But Maddie does not blink. She stares back, using a heavy silence to confirm his absolute worst fears. It is physically painful to watch Savannah twist the knife. "If she knew about your condition," Savannah says with measured cruelty, "then she knew exactly how badly this would break you. This was never a simple mistake. It was a flawlessly executed shot to his pride." It forces us to accept a dark reality about relationships. The most fatal wounds we receive rarely come from enemies charging at us. They are delivered by the quiet people sitting right next to us, who know exactly where our armor is weak. A hollow groan of defeat scrapes its way out of Brandon M.'s chest. The audio mix ensures we hear that exact sound. It is the literal frequency of a man's spirit collapsing into dust. He simply cannot process his quiet wife pulling off such a massive betrayal. His entire world is bleeding out on the rug, and standing just feet away, Colton remains chillingly still. There is no nervous twitch, no defensive shifting. Notice the brilliance of this cinematic choice. When a bomb goes off, standing completely still is the most damning confession a person can make. His silence acts as a blinding spotlight, and Savannah catches it instantly. It brings a deep truth into focus. The most lethal weapons in our lives are never our elaborate lies. They are the vital details we deliberately hold back. Unless Savannah says, dragging the word out to let the suspense suffocate the room. This was never a solo job. The heartbeat of the scene just flatlines. The rules have violently changed. This is no longer a messy family drama. It is a frantic hunt to find the apex predator hiding in plain sight. The silence feels incredibly heavy, like the breathless second before a roof caves in. But watch the profound shift in Maddie. While the men spiral into absolute panic, a beautiful, tragic clarity washes over her tired face. All those long years of walking on eggshells are entirely finished. She is fully exposed, yet surprisingly at peace. It reveals something profound. True liberation does not actually start the day you walk out the door. It starts the second you stop being afraid of what happens next. Stick with me here, because this final visual is a masterclass. The truth has been circling them in the dark for months, but denial always has an expiration date. Slowly, Savannah turns and locks her gaze onto Colton. The framing here is as precise as a sniper exhaling before pulling the trigger. She has found the architect. "It is you," she whispers. Completely stripped of any theatrical flair, it is just the terrifying click of a trap snapping shut. Brandon violently whips around, his face a hideous mask of rejection. "That is statistically impossible," he stammers. desperately trying to use math to fight a reality that is tearing his soul apart. It exposes a deeply human flaw. We will gladly cling to the most fragile, ridiculous delusions just to delay at the agonizing pain of a truly broken heart. Brandon's frantic protests echo against the walls, sounding utterly hollow. You can see the puzzle pieces snapping together within his arrogant mind. But let us shift our focus to Colton. He completely refuses to participate in the hysterical theater Brandon relies on. Colton radiates a chilling, immovable stillness. His quiet gravity makes the screaming chaos around him feel absurd. For a fraction of a second, his gaze cuts to Maddie. It is a silent, unbreakable tether, a vow that he will stand by her, even if the world burns. Savannah exhales slowly, calculating this deadly shift in the room. It leaves us with a profound truth. The most powerful person in any room is rarely the one begging for attention. Real power belongs to the one who simply refuses to react. A freezing wave of realization washes over Savannah, pulling the final thread of this mystery tight. She murmurs a quiet confirmation, a humorless smile touching her lips. Colton's terrifying calm finally makes cinematic sense. She steps closer, whispering that this is exactly why he never panicked. He already knew. Hearing those words, Brandon stumbles backward, as if the scene delivered a physical blow to his chest. The foundation of his identity turns to ash right in front of the lens. He chokes out a response, his throat constricting around the toxic truth. His fragile psychology is shutting down to protect his pride. This brings us to a devastating conclusion. The absolute hardest pill to swallow in life is always the one that permanently destroys our carefully crafted ego. The camera pushes in on Maddie as the room's power dynamic shatters. She had braced for an explosion, expecting her toxic chains to snap with violent force. Instead, the air grows heavy, settling like solid iron. Notice the subtle shift in her shoulders as her panicked heartbeat finally slows. The harsh lighting catches the deliberate, defiant lift of her chin. She is nobody's victim now. Staring dead into Brandon's hollow eyes, she tells him plainly that he has known about this all along. Those words vaporize his fake charm, leaving behind a terrified man who realizes he was never in control. He whispers a surrender, his voice stripped of power. This reveals a profound truth about human nature. Tyrants shrink to absolutely nothing the very second they realize nobody is afraid of them anymore. Let us freeze the frame right here, because you and I both knew this devastation was coming. Watch how the shadows deepen around Colton. Not a single muscle twitches on his face as he drops the heaviest truth on their chests. Look closely at Savannah. She takes a sharp breath, her cold eyes darting across the room like a predator, calculating a kill. She looks at Maddie, and the tragic realization hits her. This is not just about a child. This is a territorial flag violently driven into the earth. In their twisted world, blood is the only real currency, and Colton just bought the entire board. It leaves us with a bitter lesson we must all learn. The people who remain the quietest about their power are always the ones most prepared to burn the world down to protect what is theirs. Pause the scene again. Colton refuses to let Savannah rewrite this tragic narrative. He corrects her, using a voice so terrifyingly calm it sends ice down your spine. This is no cheap power play. This is his entire future. Watch the raw emotion flicker in his eyes. The lighting catches a fleeting glance toward Maddie, exposing a lifetime of agonizing love. Then the warmth vanishes, replaced by a stare as cold as an open grave. He drops the final hammer. They are locked out forever. Look at Brandon, standing there completely paralyzed. His years of toxic torture have been reduced to worthless ash. Savannah understands the shift, though. There is a deeply humbling truth here. Sometimes, the absolute smartest thing a person can do is accept they are outmatched, swallow their pride, and simply walk away from the ruin. You and I must watch this final sequence together. It is the cinematic payoff we have been waiting for. Watch the heavy tension finally leave Maddie's body. She lets out a shaking exhale, dropping years of terror onto the floor. The trauma does not magically vanish, of course. Human tragedy never resolves like a simple fairy tale. But let the camera linger on her face. The lighting is notably softer now. She is no longer a terrified prisoner. As Colton guides her through the smoldering ruins of her past, you witness something profoundly beautiful. She drops her victimhood like a tattered coat. It leaves us with one enduring lesson. A cruel world might shatter your spirit into pieces, but when you finally forge yourself back together, that new armor is completely unbreakable. She is no longer a tragedy. She is a survivor.